As we laboured to move forward, some men were most surreptitiously ridding themselves of one or another of these items. It was especially hard for the machine gunners, the anti-tank riflemen, and the mortar crews. Even horses could barely pull their cannons along, which kept getting stuck in the muck. We started off at dawn each morning and slogged along all day. At a short halt we would collapse, hardly finding a place even a bit drier, and our eyes would close of their own accord. But it seemed that no sooner had that happened than someone would nudge you in the side. "Get up, brother!" and we would march wearily on. We encountered buildings or huts rarely. Forest after forest, road after road, or more precisely, lack of roads. At first we battled only against rear-guard elements. The Germans were retreating quickly, and whenever leaving an area they left behind a barren wasteland. Whenever they had time to manage it, they blew up, destroyed, torched, or mined everything. "Here you go, Ivan, take your prizes." The detours, and you couldn't avoid them, were all mined. The roads were also mined, and people occasionally triggered them. Between Gzhatsk and Vyazma alone, the Germans blew up 14 bridges. Whatever official Russian historians might say, this was one of the best planned and skillfully conducted withdrawal operations of the entire war. We were unable to trap the German Ninth Army and elements of the 4th Panzer Army in the Rzhev salient, as had long been our ambition. General Model's forces suffered relatively small losses. One could not say the same thing about the Soviet forces. Every attempt to fix the German Ninth Army in place during its withdrawal led to fresh casualties in our ranks. We moved through a scarred, scorched land, which smelled of the smoke of torched structures and the stench of corpses. The Germans still didn't understand anything, neither what they had done nor the approaching retribution. Hearts became filled with hatred for the enemy, and raised voices more frequently declared, "Once we reach your land, you fools, we're going to pay you back in full." It was terrible to look at the old men and women, but especially at the children, who were wandering among the piles of ashes that had once been their village. Encountering the victims of this scorched earth policy, our soldiers would give them their last piece of bread, their last biscuit or lump of sugar, their last undershirt or towel. Army cooks fed them from the field kitchens. The division would move on, leaving the poor victims behind, and carrying away a hatred for the enemy in their hearts. The division entered Kuprianov's home region, the land around Smolensk. There were frequent engagements against German rear-guard units. Then there it was, the village of Golenishchevo, where his grandfather, mother and father lived, and where Andrei Filimonovich was born. As a young boy, from the age of 11, he had grazed cattle. By now, in pursuit of the rear-guard elements of the retreating adversary, the 31st Army had advanced to the west, some 150–160 kilometers in 21 days since the liberation of Rzhev, Vyazma and Gzhatsk. But on the 24th of March, in the area of the villages of Sergeykovo and Pantyuki, it was forced to stop when it bumped into enemy fortifications. Worn out and weakened by the frequent skirmishes, our units didn't have sufficient strength to go into battle from the march. In anticipation of a counterattack, without even a day's rest, we set to fortifying new positions for ourselves. We learned on the 31st of March that the offensive had ground to a halt everywhere along the Western Front's entire line. Smolensk still lay ahead, where, according to reconnaissance reports, the adversary had already created a firm defence, intending to halt our offensive. The command understood that it was not possible to take Smolensk from the march. We had to let our rear services catch up, but the spring thaw was already here, which badly delayed the movement of supplies. We had to replenish the ranks of the weakened battalions and satisfy the troops' needs for new equipment and ammunition. It became apparent that by the beginning of summer, a lull had fallen over both sides. We understood this as well as the Germans. However, the difference in the plans of the two sides was great. Our forces fortified their positions as a respite while preparing for a new offensive, out of concern for a possible enemy counterattack. The German army constructed its defence, knowing for certain that another Russian offensive was unavoidable, and was preparing to defend stubbornly. On one of these typical days, the next batch of mail arrived, carrying with it a telegram from my father. The chief doctor of a Moscow hospital had added a concluding note. Father was notifying me that my mama was in the hospital in serious condition. The telegram's text was ominous. What had happened? Possibly she was at death's door, or maybe she had already died? I was alarmed. What should I do? How could I help her? There was little chance they'd let me go to Moscow. A leave of absence? No, there was no point even to dream about one. The frontline soldiers had forgotten these words. I showed the telegram to Mikhalich and Stepanich. The party organizer and agitator saw the matter differently. Mikhalich firmly said, "You're panicking needlessly. The regiment is in the second echelon. We'll hardly be moving anywhere before summer, so we can get by without you for a week. If necessary, I'll go to Commissar Gruzdev myself. If the regiment commissar won't get involved, go see Commissar Borisov up at the division. He'll help you." I arranged matters with Gruzdev unexpectedly quickly. Ivan Yakovlevich was for some reason in a fine mood. Having heard me out and quickly skimmed the telegram in his hands, he gave approval for a leave. A successful start. Razumovsky, having read the request, also didn't draw out the matter, but he warned me that a regiment commander only had the right to give a leave for no more than 3 days. The next hurdle, the division's political department. I had no doubt of Borisov's support. However, Leonid Fedorovich wasn't there when I arrived. He had gone to army headquarters. His deputy, Lieutenant Colonel Kudryavtsev, was filling in for him. Kudryavtsev was a dry, prickly, expert demagogue. This situation complicated matters, but still, with the help of the medical report and personal requests, I managed to secure a pass for 10 days. 7 pairs of eyes of the other women lying in the ward looked at me. Likely, Mama sensed my presence. She opened her eyes but couldn't recognize me immediately, and she wiped her eyes with her hand a few times. "My son, my dear," she reached out for me. "How did you wind up here?" "Mamochka! First tell me what you were dreaming, then I'll unveil my secret." Mama broke into tears and began kissing my hands. They were the tears of unbridled joy. I was dreaming of the golden fish, and I asked it to help me see my son before I died. A reference to a famous Russian fairy tale about a golden fish that can grant wishes. "Now you see I'm together with you. Why die? Live on, Mamochka. My brave officer. It seems now they're praising you so highly. What happiness to see you alive, healthy and strong." We spoke for more than an hour. I told her about myself and my comrades and joked a little. Rosa Yakovlevna interrupted our meeting when she entered the room. "And here's our angel, Rosa Yakovlevna, my young saviour. She takes good care of all of us." "It is time to rest, Evgenia Borisovna," the doctor said. I submitted to the doctor's instruction. Parting, Mama asked, "Does Papa know about your arrival?" "Not yet. I came from the train station directly to see you. I'll come back tomorrow. Shall I bring you something? What would you like?" "Thank you, dear son, I don't need anything." As I walked out, all 7 women suddenly started applauding me. It was quite unexpected and touching. I bowed to the entire ward. What amazing neighbours Mama had. Not one of them asked me a single question about their own dear ones, though likely many of them had husbands and sons at the front. With such thoughts I went outside. Moscow of 1943. Before me lay the city of Moscow. What joy! Mama is alive. Soon I will see my father. I'll meet my friends. My head was spinning with happiness. I hadn't seen the city in almost 2 years. Moscow had gone through so much in that time. It had withstood the hell of bombers, a heroic city. For the first time in the entire war, it was precisely Moscow that had stopped the fascist hordes. Not a single capital in mainland Europe had managed to do that. With stupid stubbornness, Hitler had promised daily, "Tomorrow Moscow will become German." But it desired to remain Russian. Muscovites had stood up for themselves. More accurately, the entire country had fought and stood up for Moscow. The sun was shining. I walked through the streets of Moscow, filling my chest with the spring Moscow air. I went down Durov Street to the boulevard, past Durov's Corner, the joy of Moscow's children, and headed for Samotekhnaya Square. The theatre of the Red Army. I couldn't recognize it. For camouflage, architects and artists had turned this tall, monumental building, shaped like a five-pointed star, into either a forest or some sort of garden. How did they manage to do this? Unbelievable! Now here's Central Market, full of people and food. What didn't they have here? Milk, potatoes, meat and lard, vegetables. They also sold watches, firewood, books, clothing, needles and thread and soap. But at what prices? "Have you no shame?" The words burst out from me. Glancing at my officers' shoulder straps, the collective farm women in their white peasant shawls lowered their prices a little. I purchased a scrawny chicken, 3 tomatoes, 5 cucumbers, and half a kilogram of cottage cheese, and had to pay 1,000 rubles. 3 kilograms of potatoes cost 300 rubles, a litre of milk, 80 rubles. For a pair of second-hand boots, you had to pay 2,000 rubles. Not-so-great watches could be acquired for 1,500 rubles each. Most of the customers crowded around enormous bags of potatoes, which had plainly been brought from some place far away. Now for home. I heard the touchingly familiar ring of a tram not far away. Anushka! Muscovites swore mightily at trams, saying that they ran without timetables or that people were forced to wait too long for one, but I loved to travel on them, especially when I took Anushka home from Samotek Street to Sretenka Street, one of my favourite streets. But this time I decided to go on foot. I threw my kit bag, now holding the food I had purchased, over my shoulder and set off on my way, humming my favourite little tune, On the Tomcat and the Cow. Proud of the provisions I had acquired, I emerged onto Sadovoye Kolotso, looking around as I walked, not wanting to miss a single sign, shop window, or street poster. Everything became cause for reflection. Everything was important and interesting to see and remember. Back at the front, I had imagined that I would find a city without people. So many had died for it, so many had been evacuated, and the hunger, the bombing raids. Later, I found out that in 1941 alone, more than 2 million residents had been evacuated, that is, half the city's population. But the city was full of people. I attentively peered at the passers-by, how they had all changed, their expressions, their gait, their clothing, even their footwear. Civilians were dressed in identical fashion and badly. Many men and women were wearing padded trousers, jackets, and work overalls. On their feet, almost all of them were wearing rubber footwear, boots, overshoes, and galoshes. There were an unusually large number of servicemen out on the streets. Many of them, most likely, were staffers. Their faces showed self-confidence, and they looked well-fed. Their uniforms were spotless and crisply pressed, and they all seemed to be rushing somewhere. In the capital you could compile a whole book from their service addresses: the Stavka, the General Staff, the Ministry of Defence, the main political administration, the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, the colossal commissary apparatus, the main aviation administration, and anti-aircraft defence. Another category of officers on the street was people who had been discharged from hospitals. There were dozens of hospitals in Moscow, and it was noticeable how the discharged former patients leisurely strolled around the capital, soaking up the spring air and sunshine, happy to be back on their feet and to find themselves unexpectedly in the capital, another day or week, and they'd again be heading back to the front. I dropped into several stores. All the conversations in them revolved around food. Presently, food was being distributed according to ration coupons, but it often happened that there was nothing you could get for your coupons, often for several weeks in a row. Dependents were receiving practically nothing, only bread and salt. Vodka was sold only to those with special coupons they had received for good work. However, in the stores, you could freely quench your thirst with as much hot water as you wanted. Around the newsstands, there were now more of them on the streets, people continuously gathered, reading over each other's shoulders, discussing the latest news, and lambasting the Allies for dragging their feet in opening a second front. Someone even hurled the vile accusation, "saboteurs," at them. Everywhere around the city were mounted and foot patrols. They were especially frequent in the city centre and around the train stations. As I made my way home, I was stopped twice. Moscow was still a closed city, and it would likely remain that way for a long time to come. The company around the table wholeheartedly admired her, and it was noticeable that this universal admiration gave her a sense of personal satisfaction and pride. I also raised my glass to her. "Let's drink to a charming woman, to Eleanor, who everyone admires. Consider me one of them." Lena clinked glasses with me and immediately began to address me with the intimate "Ty." The Russian language still adheres to the distinction long ago abandoned in English between the intimate thou, Ty, and the formal you, vy. The evening was a success. Everyone felt unfettered and danced and joked. When I was dancing with Nelia, she asked, "Do you like Lena?" I didn't hide my feelings. Very much. "Today a surprise is waiting for us," Nelia added. "Lenka's mother is coming. She just returned from evacuation." I had already learned from my father that the top executives of the factories and the state committees had been permitted to bring their wives back to Moscow. Philippe held everyone's attention when conversation turned to our allies and the long-awaited Second Front. "When at last will our allies decide they want to get moving?" Lena exclaimed with anger. "I think most likely it will only be next year," Philippe said. "It is sad to say, but Churchill announced that they would not succeed in opening a second front on the European continent this year." Here Philippe stopped and told an anecdote. Two Muscovites are standing before a post, which has been totally pasted over with theatre posters. On all of them, in large, bold lettering, it was printed, "A. Korneichuk, the front." One man says, "That's an absolute must," simultaneously in the four best theatres. The second replies, "The Allies can't even find a way to open a second front, while we Muscovites have opened four at the same time." Who has seen Leonov's The Invasion? They say it has been nominated for a Stalin Prize. No one had seen it, but Olia said, apparently, what everybody was thinking. "I've heard The Invasion is a weak play, worse than Kornichuk's masterpiece, The Front." Nelia resolutely started to protest. "I got 2 tickets to the Moscow Art Theatre. Tomorrow I'm going with Boris to see Leonov's production." At this point, the topic of conversation changed to one that I realized was very important to the citizens of Moscow. Igor asked me, "What do you think? Will the Germans bomb Moscow again?" "I don't think so," I replied. "The Germans have been quite busy with other matters since Stalingrad, and I don't believe they're even thinking about Moscow now." Philip interceded. He said that, according to rumours, in the last month, Stalin had sent for the generals of the Moscow air defences 4 times, demanding that not a single enemy airplane appear over Moscow. He was angered back in March when fascist aviation had twice tried to break through to Moscow. Our anti-aircraft gunners shot down 15 of the 100 airplanes that were flying toward Moscow. Rumours, rumours. I came to the conclusion that the Germans must have bombed Moscow heavily. As I now understood, Moscow was living according to rumours, which reminded me of the soldier's telegraph back at the front. In both cases, the cause was probably the same, the absence of timely and reliable information. Sitting next to me, Nelia quietly said, "Philip is a colourful figure, a well-known ballet lover, but in general he's a braggart and a poser." That was precisely my opinion too. Why had he grown a moustache? It didn't help his appearance at all. But the general fashion everywhere now, not just in Moscow, was a moustache à la Stalin. Philippe, likely just to distract the gathering, idly asked, "What's new at the front?" "Oh, you vermin," I thought to myself. I grew angry. The front was not just some post papered over with theatre notices. I answered in the same tone. "Since the new year, they started distributing field blouses without pockets to the soldiers." Everyone understood my response, but it didn't seem to embarrass Philippe. Lena treated us to some real British tea. I had never had such a tasty cup of tea before. We all got ready to leave, and Philip regaled the guests, apparently with a previously prepared plum. "I've heard that Pravda will soon be printing Sholokov's They Fought for the Motherland. It's a promising title." In the corridor, we spent a long time saying our goodbyes, kissing each other and thanking the hostess. Then, suddenly, she approached me, and showing no embarrassment in front of the other guests, she began to unbutton my coat and declared in a commanding voice, "But you, Senior Lieutenant, will stay here to wash the dishes." Confused by her action, I glanced at Nelia. She imperturbably supported her friend. "It's the hostess's birthday. You should do what she wants." The guests broke out laughing, and Olia joked, "Lenka's in her repertoire." "But how will you get home alone?" I turned to Nelia. "Philippe will escort me." The lady of the house led me into the kitchen, then left, as it turned out, to change clothes. Meanwhile, I neatly washed and dried every dish, Saxon porcelain. Suddenly, Lena was standing next to me in a carefully contemplated short gown. She threw on a beautiful apron in front of me, then carefully started washing the no less precious stemware and glasses, old monogrammed wine glasses and drinking glasses. "Why are you trembling? You're not at the front, you know." "I don't shake at the front." She laughed, and then, what clumsiness, a dinner plate slipped from my hands and fell to the floor. Only shattered fragments remained of the Saxon porcelain. I blushed and began to apologize, anticipating a stern scolding, but she started laughing again. "For the broken plate, 2 extra shifts on duty. It seems that's the accepted punishment for the guilty in the army. Now go and take a bath. You're just from the lice-ridden trenches. You'll find some pyjamas there. In the morning you'll clean up the apartment and take out the trash." When I entered the bedroom after my bath and turned on the light, the first thing that caught my eye was a small book with a wine-red cover, which was lying on a nightstand next to the bed. I opened it. A Bible, in English, published in London. She's a religious woman. She knows English. Lena came into the room. She had let her hair down. Everything was somehow special, and the scent of her marvellous perfume enveloped me. She seemed like a goddess to me. "Come on, officer, sir! Straight to bed!" I obeyed. Lena herself spread out a little rug on the floor, got down on her knees, and started to pray before an icon. How had I failed to notice it? Then she read aloud in English from the Bible, and the light was turned off. A Niagara waterfall of sensations poured over me. I forgot about everything else on earth, and took pleasure in our togetherness. I never wanted this special night to end, when for the first time in my life I came to know a woman. At dawn the next day I was still dozing, but suddenly woke up with a start. Lena, tired, was still sleeping. I looked at her luxuriant red hair, which lay scattered across the pillow, her sleek, beautiful arms, and admired this natural wonder. How strange! This woman had just coincidentally and suddenly entered my life, and in just one night she had managed to make a man from a boy. Shirker had been right when he placed a woman's beauty and woman's love above all else, above books, soccer, anything. Yet together with this, a vague thought wandered into my mind. Likely, my torrid night with Lena had not been love at all, but passion, an overwhelming passion. But who will judge me and cast the first stone? In my worship of it, I had experienced heightened feelings, an almost sacred service to beauty. That night I was Suvorov himself. Lena, who by now had opened her eyes, stretched out to me. "God save you! This disgusting war, how many lives has it warped and ruined? Who can explain why people have been killing each other for thousands of years? Even Homer in front of Athens raised criticism toward Ares, the god of war, calling him an infernal madman." "You know Homer?" "No, my dear, I like his verse. Homer was a sage poet of ancient Greece. I advise you to read his poems, if only once in your life. They are the work of a philosopher." "Great," I managed to say. "Lenotchka, last night I heard that you were praying for some Fedya. Who is this man?" "I'll satisfy your curiosity. I have a husband. We met 2 years ago, before the war. At the time, Fedya was finishing his studies at the Institute of Military Translators. Now he's at the front, and every blessed day I pray for his safety. But with you, it's different. This is something else entirely." This confession stunned me, and I experienced a sharp pang of guilt. In my mind, I kept thinking, how dare I? But what was this if not my first love? And Lena was no longer the unattainable goddess to me. I was afraid to look into her eyes. The significance of this victory is being hushed up in our press. Zatukny continued. The plans of the Allies? I'll give you an answer. Their next move from Africa, most likely to Sicily. From there, plainly, to Italy and then to France. I think that is the approximate strategic plan of the Allies. Do the Germans know this? They know, but they cannot handle the air and naval might of the Allies. Armadas of American and British planes are daily bombing Germany, turning German cities into ruins and disrupting their communications. Tell me, really, is this not war with our common enemy? Fascism? Having finished what was, in practical terms, an entire lecture, which compelled the guests to push away from their food and listen attentively, Zatukny turned to me. What does a man from the front think about my conception of the situation? I'm not offering a reproach, but while they work out their strategic plans, every year, day and hour of the war's continuation mean more and more sacrifices, primarily ours. Is this just? The opening of a second front is a concern for everyone, in the rear and at the front, but the matter is being dragged out. But the talkative Zatukny had already moved on to a different topic. Where are we headed? He asked profoundly, raising his right hand. From socialist ideals to pan-slavism, from the Soviet model of life to service of the fatherland, from red commanders to officers and soldiers with czarist shoulder straps, the bells in newly reopened churches in Russia are pealing ever more loudly. I hadn't thought deeply about the details of Stalinist policy. I only knew that Moscow had recently held a World Assembly of Slavic Peoples. Nelia and I went out to have a smoke on the staircase landing. For all the days of my stay in Moscow, I hadn't smoked a single cigarette, but today, worrying and hoping for a meeting with Rosa, I lit one up. Nelia and I again argued. Your father told me that you are rebuking Muscovites as if they're not interested in life at the front, and called this narrow-mindedness. Is this true? Nelia asked. It's true, I stubbornly confirmed. That's a shame. You really don't understand how tired people have become. Look at these drawn, sallow faces, these hunched figures, the sagging women's breasts, and I'm not speaking about their clothing. The people are giving everything they can to the front, husbands, sons, daughters, spiritual and physical strength, but the end of the war is still not in sight. Don't judge the life of the average Muscovite by Lena's example. Lena is washing cucumbers daily, though one cucumber costs 20 rubles at the market. But the young people, they are in a terrible situation. They work 12-hour shifts at the factory, with no days off, without normal sleep and a normal diet. Horrible housing conditions, millions of people are living in barracks. Yet every night all these children stand watch on the rooftops. But their youth is passing. And what of the girls? They want love, a personal life, to wear nice lingerie and not the same poorly washed bra she must keep wearing over and over again, and to have just one pair of undarned stockings. I'm not even talking about a bar of soap or perfumes. Those are beyond the wildest dreams. But it is worst of all for old people. They are dying like flies. But everyone keeps making patriotic appeals to us. Stricken, I listened to Nelia silently, like a man without a tongue, and thought, who of us is right? Of course, it was hard for a frontline soldier to understand how the home front was living, but it was also hard for people in the rear to understand us, the frontline soldiers. What was going on with all of us? I suddenly wanted to change the subject, to end this unpleasant conversation, so I asked, why did you take me to see Leonov's play? In the press, they are calling the play the most serious comment on the war. I thought it would be interesting to hear the opinion of a man from the front. The actors performed their roles strongly, but for the spectator it was boring, far-fetched, and far from real life. So it seemed to me, a real play about the war probably still lies in our future. But on this evening, speaking honestly, Rosa was occupying my mind and commanding my attention. She was dressed modestly, without any adornments, but quite tastefully. I liked the fine features of her face. Her beautiful black hair, which had been neatly pulled back into a bun, her large grey eyes, which calmly and attentively took in all the guests. But for some reason she didn't look in my direction, probably because she was feeling too shy. She blushed when Mamma said some kind words about her. I also liked her simple but sincere toast. To a good Mamma and her valiant soldier. After such a toast, I decided to act. If I was lucky, things might go at a good clip. Rosa Mama asked me to escort Rosa home. It turned out that she lived in Marinaya Rossa, which was a dangerous district of the city even before the war. For the first time in Moscow, I took my pistol with me. Rosa was silent almost the whole way. I couldn't endure it. "Did you enjoy the evening?" "Very much. Lovely, sweet people surround your family." "Then why are you being quiet, Doctor?" "I don't know. All kinds of thoughts." "For example?" "I'm tormented. Should I invite you into my house or not?" "Invite me!" slipped out of my mouth. I was becoming more and more drawn to her. Rosa burst out laughing. "Great! Only don't then become angry. The conditions at my place are terrible, even shameful." At last we reached Rosa's home. Deep darkness in the courtyard and entrance, then a narrow, creaking staircase with a rotted, sticky railing. We cautiously climbed to the second floor. Until we reached it, I probably lit a half-box of matches, one match at a time, to light our way. Rosa opened the door. Again, darkness, but this time a long, gloomy corridor. Its right side was cluttered up with ramshackle furniture, stinking with mould and rot. Along its left side were 12 doors. It was an enormous communal residence. The second door led into my lady's little room. Rosa approached a table in the centre of the room and lit the wick of a kerosene lamp. The modest furniture of her residence appeared before me. Rosa had found space for an old worn-out sofa, 3 little shelves with books, and a sideboard along 3 of the walls. In front of the far wall stood a low screen, which appeared to be concealing the bedroom. A rack with a few nails was hanging on the door, upon which the hostess hung the greatcoat that she had taken from me and her own overcoat. It was chilly in the room. I stood quietly. "Once again, excuse me for my God-forsaken hole of a residence," Rosa said with embarrassment. "You are the first person that I've invited to my room. Take it as a sign of respect, because you are from the front after all. As you can see, we have no electricity, no baths either. The kitchen and the toilet are at the end of the hallway. But I'm grateful to fate even for this. My parents and I were living on the outskirts of Moscow. My parents are still there. But by some miracle I managed to obtain a Moscow residence permit and this room, and they've even put me on the list for improvements." "Does everybody have rooms like this here?" I asked. "Pretty much the same. We have a resident, an alcoholic, they call him Fedot. He managed to build himself a homemade heater and sells places around it to the other residents. On cold days, people purchase a spot around the heater and occupy it from morning on. They take turns warming themselves up. However, my pride is my telephone, which they gave me because I am a doctor. Incidentally, make a call so they won't be worried at your house." I dialed the number and told a lie that I again had let slip the start of curfew, so I would be spending the night with the Lvov family. "Deceiver!" Rosa laughed out loud, shaking her head. "But so be it. I'll let you stay the night here, and you can have the sofa. Now I'm going down to the kitchen, where I'll brew some tea for us. We'll drink the tea with some tasty jam." I stayed behind to examine her small library. Books about medicine were standing on one shelf. Another was full of published Russian classics, while the third contained some poetry books. Then we comfortably arranged ourselves around the little table, and we drank tea while Rosa told me about her family and her life. "I practically don't. Remember my father? I was too young when he died. But I recall my mother's clear, beautiful voice and her unearthly singing. I've often dreamed about it." In 1943, it had become a different army, having passed through the harsh school of battles, in particular around Rzhev. Second, each warrior, marching westward, had painfully witnessed the German occupiers' new order, and this was not propaganda footage but living, tragic images of what the enemy had done to Russian land. and now, standing on the defensive, we were preparing for a new offensive. The division received a major influx of new troops. Over the 4 months from April to the start of August, the soldiers, moving mountains of earth, had fortified strong centres of resistance and had built strong points at the company and platoon level, equipped with machine guns. In sectors vulnerable to tank attack, they had dug anti-tank ditches, placed anti-tank obstacles, built hedgehog positions, and mined everything they could. Dozens of kilometres of entrenchments, shielded by coils of barbed wire, had been dug, together with communication trenches. From morning until late into the night, Vasily Alexeyevich Polovik, the new commander of the 220th Rifle Division, went around the regiments and battalions, inspecting their work. A few officers looked sceptically at the daily exhausting labour undertaken by the division commander. "Why are we doing this? At any time now we'll be back on the offensive. Defence is a temporary matter." The colonel patiently explained, "The essence of the defences we have created, possibly for not long, is the prevention of a sudden spoiling attack. Do you want to bleed the division white before our offensive even begins?" It is curious, but the soldiers didn't grumble. One Ukrainian soldier explained their mood better than anyone else. "Let's hope it tempts the enemy to strike." Together with the construction of fortifications, the division commander organised combat training for the rifle battalions and companies. Not far behind the front lines, a concealed place had been selected to serve as a training ground. Here the soldiers, particularly the new soldiers, rehearsed attacks, learned how to repel counterattacks, and practiced tank infantry cooperation. An amusing incident occurred while we were in reserve. One day we learned that a theatrical troupe with 3 actresses was going to visit the regiment. Commissar Gruzdev ordered me to receive the troupe, greet them warmly, and escort them while they were in the regiment area. Mikhalik, Stepanich, and I decided to organise a small reception for the actresses. We scrounged for food to serve. As I recall, we were able to find 20 grams of butter and 5 potatoes, and began saving our daily 100 grams of vodka for the special occasion. We even decorated the walls of our dugout as best we could. The eagerly awaited day soon arrived, and the actresses put on a show for the soldiers. They sang, played guitar, and recited poetry to the warm applause of the officers and soldiers. When the show ended, I asked the young women, who were no more than 25 or 26 years of age, to visit our dugout. They agreed, and soon we were toasting each other and talking about our lives at the front and in Moscow. But suddenly I heard the harsh words of our regiment commander, "Bring them to my bunker." The ladies didn't seem too interested in leaving, and they promised to return. They never did. We waited for them in vain, continuing to down shots of vodka. Quite intoxicated, I cursed the regiment commander and resolved to bring back the actresses at gunpoint if necessary. Mikhalik, equally drunk, staggered over and handed me his pistol. I grabbed it, got up, went outside, and decided to head to the commander's bunker. Lord knows what might have happened if just then a vehicle hadn't stopped in front of me. An officer stepped out. He asked me, "Where are the actresses? I've come for them at the request of the division commander." The general took the 3 actresses from the colonel. For all I know, the young women wound up travelling up the ranks of command all the way to the army level. On the 5th of July, the regiment was suddenly warned a surprise from the other side was anticipated. Everyone, from the division commander down to the last soldier, spent 3 or 4 days, I don't remember exactly, in the trenches on combat alert. Behind us, a well-equipped artillery regiment, complete with rocket launchers, took position. More machine pistols and submachine guns had appeared in the companies. A tank brigade arrived. The adversary now and then bombarded our front lines. Likely they too were on the alert. Soon the order to pull back arrived, and like lightning, word travelled around the regiments about the grandiose battle at the Kursk-Orel Bulge. It had started on the 5th of July and continued for several days. Now we knew why the warning of a surprise had been issued. The success at Kursk prompted general joy. "Now at last," the soldiers said, "it's kaput for them." Exactly so. It is time to prepare the hearses. Alas, there were still almost 2 long, bloody years of war before the final victory and the final burial of the German army. The 7th of August morning. An artillery cannonade announces the beginning of the offensive on the Smolensk bridgehead for 3 fronts, the Kalinin, the Western, and the Baltic. After a 90-minute preparatory artillery barrage, the battle for Smolensk begins to unfold. Company after company rises and goes into the attack. From the very first battle, the fighting is vicious and bitter. Despite the adversary's counterattacks and his superiority in the air, and overcoming the wall of heavy machine gun fire thrown up by the enemy, our units break into the hostile trenches and begin chewing their way through the enemy's defences. The 7th of August, night. Division Commander Polovic introduces fresh forces into the breakthrough sector, supported by artillery fire. The 8th of August, morning. The 1st Battalion of the 673rd Rifle Regiment reaches Shishlovskaya Roshcha and the village of Rybki. Artillery and mortar batteries shift their fire onto the adversary's 2nd and 3rd lines of defence. The 8th of August, afternoon and evening. After a massive artillery barrage, the battalions surge into the enemy's 2nd line of trenches. The Germans strengthen their resistance. Heavy fighting erupts, and battles go on for every clump of ground. The 9th of August, morning and afternoon. The adversary brings up reserves to the breakthrough sector, and with several energetic counterattacks throws the regiment back to the 1st line of trenches. The number of dead and wounded swells on both sides. The 673rd and 653rd Rifle Regiments cling to the ground they've gained with difficulty. The advance grinds to a halt. German assault groups, actively supported from the air, manage to drive wedges into the division's lines. The situation becomes critical. At that moment, as the battalions of the 673rd Rifle Regiment begin to waver, Sergeant Vasily Ragulin deploys a self-made banner and with a shout, "For the motherland! Hurrah! Ah!" he gets prone soldiers to rise to their feet and leads them into a counterattack. The Germans are stunned for several moments. The retreat of the battalions has been stopped. Here is how this turning point in the battle was described in the divisional newspaper. He, V. Ragulin, was the first to hurl himself at the enemy. The battalion Komsorg Boris Flegboim and many soldiers rushed after him. They managed to restore the situation. A grenade exploded near Ragulin. His face inundated with blood, he, paying no attention to the wound, immediately cut down a German officer with a burst from his submachine gun. However, the command comes to a conclusion. The danger of the operation's collapse has not disappeared, and there is a need for the reallocation of forces. The command for a general withdrawal is issued. The active measures of the German Air Force are particularly worrisome. The 9th of August evening. After a reshuffling of forces, the 673rd Regiment goes back onto the attack and again seizes Shishlovskaya Roshcha and the village of Kudinovo, as well as Rybki. Without slackening the pace of attack, we force a crossing of the Vidosa River. The 10th of August. With the support of tanks and airplanes, the adversary counterattacks again and again. The fighting grows even hotter. Both sides are suffering heavy losses. Soldiers are showing unparalleled stubbornness and courage. In some battalions, only 20 or 30 men remain. The entire regimental artillery moves up to fire over open sights. Many tanks are knocked out and left burning. Finally, unable to withstand the pressure, the adversary gives way. 11, 12, and the 13th of August. The 673rd Rifle Regiment continues its pursuit, although the men remaining in the ranks continue to dwindle. By the end of the 14th of August, Spas-Demansk and hundreds of villages have been liberated. The division is pulled back into reserve. The 251st Rifle Division takes its place at the front. During the course of this offensive, our division was pulled back into the second echelon for replenishment 4 times, which testifies to the severity of the fighting and the serious losses. Division Commander Polovic arrived at our regiment headquarters. Normally a stern, taciturn man, this time he openly displayed his admiration for the courage of the men and thanked the soldiers for their stubbornness and bravery. "Where's your hero, Ragulin?" he asked. "Tell him to come to me. I found Vasily Ivanovich, and when he entered the commander's bunker, Polovik said, "I am proud of you, soldier. You saved the regiment from being thrown back to the starting line. You may not have made it into the history books, but you made an invaluable contribution to the victory." The words of the division commander meant a lot to the soldier, but he said only a few words in reply. I did what I could. The comrades did their part too. The division went on to liberate more villages and towns as the battle continued through the hot summer and early autumn of 1943. It's the first time I've seen such a thing. I agree with you, Osir. Is this a trap? Podchezertsev and his deputy commander for political affairs, Osip Yudin, were talking. Privately, they addressed each other by their first names. What will we do if they return? Yudin asked. Fight, the battalion commander answered. By evening, the regiment commander promised to send up 2 45mm anti-tank guns and some reinforcements, and a mortar platoon is on its way. The radio squawked, and I was handed an order from Gruzdev. The Komsorg will return to the command post immediately. Again I'm being extricated, but what does he need? I was surprised. Let's forget about it, guys. I don't want to go back, and the situation here is complicated. An order is an order, the battalion commander objected. Get moving, Komsorg. We'll manage without you. We quickly embraced, and I left the birch grove. I never saw them alive again. While I was making my way back to the command post, a battle had already erupted on the height. It turned out that several self-propelled guns, accompanied by submachine gunners, had emerged from the forest, heading in the direction of the grove. Razumovsky ordered the artillery to cut them off from Podchezertsev's battalion by fire. The battle on the hilltop flared. After 2 hours, we lost communications with the battalion. Razumovsky, alarmed by the prolonged silence, sent scouts and some radio men forward to investigate the height, but they didn't manage to reach it. They were met by heavy machine gun fire. It had become clear the adversary held the height again. But where was our battalion? Closer to evening, Razumovsky summoned me. We need to find out what happened to the battalion. If we detach a company, can you lead it to the summit by the same route Podchezertsev took? I confirmed that I could. A company was quickly gathered, with a scout platoon attached to it. Twilight was already falling, and the regiment commander handed me his American-made flashlight. The unit and I set out into the gathering darkness. The situation repeated itself. After a quick skirmish, the Germans abandoned their positions again. We found a tragic scene on the hilltop. The ground was piled with the corpses of our guys and Germans. At the place where the commander's dugout had been, a deep crater was yawning. Razumovsky contacted me for a situation report. It was clear that the German attack had been sudden. Judging from the position of the bodies and the wounds, savage hand-to-hand fighting had occurred. None of our men survived. There was no one who could tell us how everything happened, and no one to advise us whether something similarly cruel and unexpected was lying in wait for us. The wind slightly rustled the branches of the delicate birch trees, and it was quiet in the pretty birch grove. But this silence was oppressive. Both the living and the dead were silent. I picked a bouquet of flowers and laid it on the ground among the dead. The ground accepted everyone, soldiers and commanders. They were together in battle and were now resting in the same common grave. The frontline press said not a word about the incident. Soon a new regiment commander came to replace Razumovsky. Everyone began to forget what had happened, but I didn't. I had lost 2 comrades. I was attached to them. On marches, I always sought to be with their battalion, and together we had travelled the path from Rzhev to their final resting place on this nameless height. Had this operation been so necessary? I kept asking the question and never found an answer. In my memory, Ivan Podchezertsev and Osip Yudin have been preserved as an inseparable team. One, a real commander, the other, a real commissar. Yudin was serving with the battalion even before Podchezertsev. He was somewhat younger than the battalion commander, but they had liked each other from the first meeting. Osip had graduated from a pedagogical institute, and before the war he was teaching literature in school. In contrast with Podchezertsev, he wasn't a professional soldier. He wound up as a political worker by chance. Podchezertsev was compact and thick-set, with an almost round face and closely cropped hair. Yudin was tall and thin, with a head of luxurious black hair and a fine face with an inquisitive look. One was a major, the other a senior lieutenant. Both had travelled the path from Moscow to just beyond Smolensk. Each man had been wounded twice. Neither man reached the age of 30. A strong fellow. That's what his subordinates had to say about Podchezertsev, having in mind not only his external appearance. Strapping, broad-shouldered, with powerful arms, what did Ivan not do prior to the war? He worked as a combine driver, then from the combine transferred to the tractor. One time he drove his tractor out onto a highway when the motor suddenly died, and a car struck his tractor. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. He served 1 year, but there they reviewed his case and released him. In 1936 he was drafted into the army. He finished military school, then served a year near Ternopil. Somehow Podchezertsev wound up under the eye of Christoforovich, that's what they called Colonel Bagramian then, who at the time was chief of the Kiev Military District's operations staff. One day Bagramian's vehicle got stuck along the road to Ternopil after its engine had started sputtering. Ivan fixed the problem in 1 minute. The colonel thanked him and wanted to bring him along with him, to take him as an assistant, but for some reason it didn't happen. Podchezertsev didn't like fancy talking. He appreciated the simple Russian word. He didn't drink or smoke. God forbid, if he ever laid eyes on some intoxicated company commander, a reduction in rank surely followed. He was the first of the commanders to abandon the faulty pre-war manuals that proved useless in this war, and he began to learn how to fight from the Germans. He was one of the first men in the division to master radio communications. He actively responded to the call by the front commander to apply principles of military engineering to the construction of trench defences, in place of haphazardly arranged foxholes and entrenchments. The battalion commander wasn't very fond of the tanks and their crews, but he became tight with the artillerymen and mortarmen. He sought to select experienced fighters for his battalion. On the attack, he always searched for the weakest points in the adversary's defences, and then led his battalion to break through at one of these spots. He tried to take care of his men and was a good soul. Everyone knew this, and many soldiers tried to get into his battalion. Razumovsky considered Podchezertsev's battalion to be his special assault force, and he always gave it the hardest tasks, confident that Podchezertsev could handle them. Once, as I was leaving to visit another battalion, Ivan gave me a German Solingen razor, a valuable present. He gave a sad smile and said, "Now, whenever you shave, you'll remember Ossip and me." Only now, as I write this, do I recall that he often seemed sad when I saw him, as if something was troubling him. Perhaps this was a presentiment? The Stavka was planning for the liberation of Belorussia to occur in 1944. However, our 673rd Rifle Regiment, having forced a crossing of the Maria River on the 7th of October 1943 with a resolute push, forced its way into Liadi, the first liberated point on Belarusian soil. Overcoming enemy resistance, we carefully avoided the famous steep slopes of the riverbank on the outskirts of Liadi, which, according to the testimony of Caulaincourt, had brought terror to the ignominiously retreating French army. At Liadi, Caulaincourt wrote, we had to descend such a steep slope, but its icy surface was so crowded with the bodies of many thousands of men and horses, which were simply tumbling downward, that we were forced to do what everyone else was doing, that is, slide down on our own posteriors. The Emperor had to descend in the same fashion. Liadi was a large village situated on the high banks of the Dnepr River, but instead of the region's fruiting apple trees, the pride of Belarusians, we found piles of ashes, cut-down gardens and streets overgrown with nettles and tall weeds. People were jumping out of dugouts to meet us, disbelieving their own eyes. In pitiful rags and barefooted, they came running up from all sides, shouting something hoarsely and loudly, and then they all hurried toward the river. Not understanding what had happened, we ran after them. On the riverbank, by the side of a ditch, we found many bodies: women, old men, children. More accurately, we were looking at their badly decomposed remains. In the district, a partisan unit had been operating. One day, a German security unit, comprised of disloyal Russians, surrounded the partisan unit. After a stubborn battle, the entire partisan unit was wiped out. The Germans learned of the partisan unit's connections with the people of Liadi. On April 2, 1942, Gestapo personnel burned the village and, having lined up its citizens on the ashes, shot every 10th person. For over a year and a half, the residents had not been permitted to bury their family members. The Germans wanted the dead to remain as a frightening warning. Together with the residents, we held a mournful assembly at the place of execution and vowed to take revenge upon the fascists. What was the purpose of the Germans' atrocities? Obviously, they were meant to frighten the people, but these atrocities generated a reciprocal reaction: hatred for the occupiers. The people's rumour mill spread word of the atrocities far and wide, refuting the propaganda about the new order. People could sense that life under German rule was far worse than life in the kolkhozes. The Hitlerites were fighting against the Bolsheviks, while at the same time they were pushing the people toward the enemy they were fighting. At the entrance to Liadi, the Germans had erected an enormous wooden panel. On it, they had hung an artfully produced sign with the inscription, "Greetings from Joseph Goebbels to the Belarusian people on the occasion of their liberation from the Bolsheviks." Now, taken down and tossed onto the ground, the sign was being trampled underfoot by our marching soldiers. It was precisely here, in Liadi, where the soldiers' saying was born, "Don't go into battle like a polite guest. Gather your fury." Reinforcements, the Red Army had broken open the gates to the west, but the victory was not decisive. Trying to liberate Mogilev and Orsha, the troops of the Belarusian Front, formerly the Central Front, encountered stubborn enemy resistance and could not break it from the march. This meant that we had not succeeded in taking full possession of the Smolensk axis of advance. Key positions at Vitebsk, Mogilev, and Orsha remained in enemy hands. New bloody battles lay ahead. In mid-October 1943, the division was withdrawn into reserve. Soon, new reinforcements arrived. I, together with other staff members, was instructed to receive the freshly baked soldiers. My meetings with the new recruits left me dissatisfied. Many of them were from the southern republics, which meant we would have to teach them some Russian quickly. Many had never held a rifle before arriving here and didn't even know what it was called. I asked one Uzbek, "Do you understand what a rifle is and what it's for?" "I've never thought it over, comrade officer." "Well, think about it now. When you go into battle, shoot at the fascists, and if they come after you, you simply can't get by without it. The rifle is your protection. Do you know what a fascist is?" Silence. I had to carry on such conversations. Many of the new soldiers were uneducated and illiterate. A few, for example, thought islands floated on the sea, but I sought, from the very first moments of their arrival, to help them feel as equals among equals. I asked the company commanders to place the new soldiers under the wings of experienced soldiers. We had to teach the new recruits how to overcome the fear of tanks and how to handle themselves during bombing attacks, particularly from Ep.7 Stukas. We had to teach them how to handle themselves on the battlefield, how to rise from the ground at the start of an attack, and how to understand their responsibility to the oath they had taken. They also had to learn the basics, such as which flank was the right one and which the left. Bombing attacks were the hardest thing for them, both physically and psychologically. "Remember, friend," experienced frontline soldiers told them, "if an airplane is flying at a high altitude, it is harmless for you. Ignore it, let it fly on. But when it comes at you in a dive, strafing you, or has already released a bomb, then take cover. The bomb will undoubtedly fall nearby." The Germans bombed us for entire days. Where was our air force? We never saw it. Up to 30 or 40 German airplanes would wheel above us, releasing their deadly loads in turn. Whenever the Junkers appeared, the howling of the new recruits was terrifying. It was hard to teach them to adapt to frontline conditions, but strangely, it was easier to deal with this category of new recruits than with another group of reinforcements. As the Germans retreated from the occupied regions, the ranks of battalions and companies were fleshed out with local residents. Of course, they were only those who had not collaborated with the Germans. Most of these new recruits were opportunists, people who had been hunted down, rounded up, and sent to fight. For some reason, they were nicknamed fiancés. There was no noticeable enthusiasm to fight among them, and many of them looked at their new position as a burden, which only raised hatred in their hearts for military authority. A mobile brothel and other strange encounters truck rolled into our bivouac area, carrying a strange cargo: 4 young women, a large samovar, and bags of tea leaves and sugar. The truck was on its way toward the front lines. The regiment commander pulled me aside and quickly explained that this was a mobile brothel. 2 of the women were to service the company and platoon commanders. The other 2 women were to brew tea for selected soldiers from the rifle companies. The truck stopped shortly before it reached the front lines. 2 men helped the women unload the samovar and bags of tea. Groups of soldiers, mostly Central Asians who drink green tea like Russians drink vodka, gathered around the samovar, plainly satisfied to be out of the trenches for a moment. I noticed a line of officers outside a dugout, mostly junior and senior lieutenants, sitting and smoking. I approached them and asked what was going on. One replied, "Take a seat, senior lieutenant. A free ticket to paradise awaits." I declined the invitation. Later, I had a chance to speak briefly with one of the young women. She told me that her name was Inna. She had recently escaped the Germans, reached our lines, and was conscripted into the Red Army. Inna said she had been told that her role was to indulge the officers and promise decorations and a leave of absence in return. Once the day ended, the truck moved on without ceremony. Rumours later swirled that this was an idea of Stalin himself, adopted from the Germans, who operated brothels for their officers and soldiers behind the front lines. If so, it must have been a brief experiment that failed. I never witnessed or heard about another such mobile brothel for the rest of the war. The 7th of November, 1943. After regrouping and a short rest, the division entered the front lines east of Orsha. The Germans were resisting fanatically, trying at any cost to stop the Red Army's offensive. On November 7th, in honour of the national holiday, the enemy decided to surprise us with a counterattack. The situation became fluid, and enemy self-propelled guns with submachine gunners managed to penetrate the lines and advance into the depth of the regiment's defences. A handful of soldiers, under the leadership of Battalion Chief of Staff Senior Lieutenant Kuznetsov, tried to stop the enemy, but failed. The attackers quickly advanced toward the regiment command post. The recently assigned regiment commander, Colonel Semen Vladimirovich, was shaken and lost control of his battalions. He turned to Commissar Gruzdev and asked, "What shall we do?" "What do you mean?" Ivan Yakovlevich was surprised. "We fight, but we only have our personal sidearms. But we also still have communications. The god of war, artillery, will help us." No longer paying attention to the despondent face of Epifanov, Gruzdev turned to the artillery spotters in the bunker and ordered, "Radio your commander! We need urgent support!" Within minutes, the guns began to thunder. The self-propelled guns were rapidly approaching. Only about 250-300 metres remained to our position. Suddenly, one erupted in flames, a direct hit. The remaining enemy vehicles divided and began to encircle us. The spotters kept passing target coordinates back to the artillerymen over the radio. A storm of fire blanketed the Germans, but the self-propelled guns reacted calmly, only occasionally firing rounds in our direction. However, having drawn close to the command post, they poured shell after shell into it. We hid in the bunker, relying on its strong cover, but the hut, as Gruzdev had ironically named it, couldn't take the punishment and collapsed. The fatal blow tossed us in every direction. A few men were fatally injured, others were badly hurt, and several received concussions. Both artillery spotters assigned to us perished. The artillerymen didn't need any further corrections. They had already called down an impenetrable wall of fire that blocked the Germans' advance, forcing them to withdraw. We had to make use of every opportunity. There was no peace for us. The enemy could counter-attack at any moment. We could not stop. We had to move forward, just as we had to keep pressing to liberate Orsha and all of Belarus. Their defensive fortifications were strong and deeply echeloned, and they took advantage of the difficult terrain in the area. But misled by our masking and deception measures and their own erroneous assumptions, Hitler and the German High Command made a profound strategic error. Believing that our main 1944 summer offensive would fall south of the Pripyat marshes, Hitler had concentrated nearly all the main panzer and motorized formations on the Eastern Front to the south, in the Ukraine. Thus, Army Group Centre lacked the mobile forces necessary to counter any of our tank breakthroughs. For Operation Bagration, the Stavka arrayed the reinforced forces of the 1st Baltic Front, 1st Belarusian Front, 2nd Belarusian Front, and 3rd Belarusian Front around the German salient. Led by General Ike Bagramian, General K.K. Rokossovsky, General G.F. Zakharov, and General I.D. Cherniakovsky respectively, each front was commanded by a highly capable, experienced general who had passed through the harsh academy of the initial war years. The Red Army had its typical quantitative superiority over the defending German forces, and in the designated breakthrough places, the fronts held an enormous superiority over the enemy in men, tanks, and artillery. But the Red Army of 1944 was qualitatively different from its previous versions. The new Red Army had been tempered in battle and was now equipped with the latest military equipment. Command and control were greatly improved, and thanks to Allied military assistance through Lend-Lease, the full effects of which were now beginning to tell, the Red Army had far greater mobility. For the first time, the complete superiority of the Soviet Air Force was evident. The Stavka also prepared thoroughly and in great detail for the offensive, including such aspects as training, reconnaissance, and the coordination of forces. Under strict secrecy and rigorous measures to conceal our movements, formations were shifted and redeployed to concentrate strength at the selected points of attack. As part of the massive preparations for the offensive, in early June 1944 our division was transferred to the 36th Rifle Corps, 31st Army of the 3rd Belarusian Front. Our army's mission was to attack along both banks of the Dnepr River in the direction of Dubrovno and Orsha, and, together with the 11th Guards Army, liquidate the German Orsha grouping. Before the start of Operation Bagration, on several occasions, the Germans had broadcast to us, "Don't let our hedgehog bite you in the arse, Ivan, he." After these transmissions, our annoyed division commander, General Polovic, would tell us, "OK, we'll show them, he." On the 23rd of June at 6:40 a.m., the first salvos of Katyusha rockets soared into the sky, announcing the onset of Operation Bagration. The artillery, mortar, and aerial attacks struck the adversary simultaneously with unbelievable force. "Just try, German, to hold out!" our frontline soldiers joyfully kept repeating. Inspired by the previously unseen support on the ground and from the air, our soldiers rushed into the attack. It was the job of our division to take Bureau Selo, one of the enemy's main strongpoints on our army's line of advance toward Dubrovno. Skovorodkin's 653rd Rifle Regiment was the first to go into battle, but the attackers ran into heavy walls of fire from not fully suppressed enemy weapon emplacements. Polovic threw the 376th Rifle Regiment at the designated breakthrough spot in support, but this regiment too was stopped. The wall of fire forced the soldiers to dig in up to their ears. The first 2 days passed without any visible result other than heavy casualties. He! Again rang out over the airwaves. General Polovic flew into a rage, but then a situation arose that allowed the division commander to undertake a successful manoeuvre. Our division's right flank 673rd Rifle Regiment, attacking relentlessly along the Moscow-Minsk highway, penetrated the enemy's defences and forced the Germans to retreat. The left flank of the enemy around Bureau Selo became exposed. The division commander ordered the 673rd Regiment to withdraw back across the Dnieper River, redeploy, and then force a new crossing of the river at a different location. The regiment smoothly carried out the assignment. After this manoeuvre, all 3 regiments struck the adversary simultaneously and from different directions. At 2:30 a.m. on the 26th of June, enemy resistance at Buroselo collapsed, and the Germans abandoned the town to prevent their encirclement. In this battle, as I was dashing across the Minsk highway, I had a very close call with death. Some German fool tried to plug me with a bullet. Like a razor, the bullet neatly clipped the watch off my left wrist and blew it to pieces. On this day, I also encountered a German Ferdinand heavy tank destroyer for the first time. These German marvels, which mounted their powerful 88mm pack gun on the chassis of a Porsche Tiger, had been deployed on the Minsk highway as a tank barrier. Some T-34S calmly manoeuvred around the barrier, approached it from both flanks to extremely close range, and then shot up the armoured monsters from their 85mm cannons without any fuss. Minsk time was pressing. It was necessary to reach Minsk as soon as possible and continue the pursuit of the retreating enemy. Tanks led the way, followed by the leading units of our division, mechanized infantry on Studebaker trucks. The rest of the division advanced on horse-drawn carts. Having reached the city's outskirts successfully, we disembarked and entered the city as scattered fighting was still going on. The city was burning. After 3 years of German occupation, it represented a terrible spectacle with its emptiness, lifelessness, and destitute streets. A multitude of corpses, both German and ours, lay scattered about everywhere. Grenade explosions and gunfire were still erupting, and from time to time tanks rushed past, leaving plumes of dust in their wake. The smell of burning lingered in the air. Groups of frightened residents were reluctant to emerge from building basements, ditches, and dugouts, still not believing what was happening and that their liberation was at hand. Our mechanized infantry had followed the tanks into the city. Leaping from the trucks, our soldiers started rooting Germans out of buildings, basements, and sheds. By the middle of the day, a battalion had reached the House of Government and the House of the Red Army, the tallest buildings in the city. The Germans had mined both buildings and prepared them for demolition. People from the underground resistance helped the sappers make their way to the subfloors of the building so they could cut the wires leading to the demolition charges. On the top floors of the buildings, which had recently been liberated from the Germans, red flags began to flutter in the wind. I had passed them out to soldiers before the start of the offensive. People then rushed to embrace us, and there were tears of joy. Moonshine appeared, and the people brought us modest treats, kissed us repeatedly, and thanked us. From all directions, partisans were leading captured Germans, some of whom had changed into civilian clothing, which seemed to amuse the partisans. "We almost let the vermin get away. We didn't recognize them at first glance." By the end of the day, handmade flags also began to fly over many buildings. Surviving citizens had raised them. We didn't stop in Minsk, but passed through it to a designated assembly point and stopped in the nearest village. Having washed and eaten a bite, the exhausted soldiers dropped onto the grass. General Polovic strictly ordered, "Don't touch anyone before morning." The Mobile Battalion. Within the framework of the continuing operation, the 31st Army's commander ordered the formation of a mobile battalion of around 200 men to equip it properly and send it without delay toward the Neman River. The battalion was ordered to reach the Neman, avoiding all battles, and seize a bridgehead across it in order to secure a crossing place for the entire division. The battalion was ordered to be ready to move out at 5 a.m. on the 5th of July. Colonel Kudryavtsev was placed in command of the mobile unit, which was mounted on Studebaker trucks. Kudryavtsev already had considerable experience for a task like this, as he had previously commanded a forward detachment, Peredovoy Otriad. The commander of the 673rd Rifle Regiment, to which the division commander had entrusted such an important job, created the unit from experienced frontline soldiers. They came primarily from the 2nd Battalion and formed the core of the unit. The commander of the 2nd Battalion, Senior Lieutenant Zakhar Dayudin, and his deputy commander for political affairs, Lieutenant Georgy Mishinsky, also became part of the new unit as did the battalion Komsorg Lieutenant Pasha Bernikov, who was an experienced intelligent officer. The regiment's political department included me in the unit as well. The mobile unit was well armed: 15 light machine guns, 1 heavy machine gun, and 3 45mm anti-tank guns, as well as snipers and anti-tank riflemen. All the soldiers received PPS-841 submachine guns. We were equipped with 2 radio sets, and even medics, and we received dry rations for 5 days. The vehicles were loaded to the maximum with ammunition, fuel, and food. On the 5th of July at 5:30 a.m., the unit set off on its way. The vehicle with Battalion Commander Diudin led the column, acting as both the scout and combat security. Colonel Kudryavtsev followed Diudin's truck in his Willys Jeep, which also had a radio set and a guard. The rest of the column followed Kudryavtsev's Jeep. I rode in the tail vehicle so I could observe the entire column and advise the colonel of anything happening behind him. The trucks followed a strictly defined route on a map. We moved along forested roads, trying to avoid main thoroughfares, heavily populated areas, and even small villages. Every 3 hours, the column stopped for 20 or 30 minutes to communicate by radio with the division and allow the men a rest. The July day was long, the evening was bright. The trucks didn't stop until midnight, and by 5 a.m., with the first streaks of dawn, we loaded up again and moved out. Following my rule to remain among the rank and file, I refused a spot in the truck's cabin and sat together with the soldiers in the back. Next to me on my right was Ilya Selekov. Ilya was from a family of peasants and had been serving since 1941. He was a former border guard, the only surviving man from his border unit. Wounded 3 times, he had been decorated with the Order of the Red Star. Before the war, I had never once spent time in a village, and I could only imagine what they were like from the books of Tolstoy, Turgenev, Leskov, and Chekhov. They were in the school curriculum, but they offered only depictions of the old, pre-revolutionary village. I learned about the Soviet village for the first time from our servant, 17-year-old Tanya. In the beginning of the 1930s, during the period of collectivization and the notorious famine in the Ukraine, Tanya's parents had been sent to Siberia, but she had managed to escape to her native village. At the time, we were living in the Ukraine, in Krivoy Rog, where my father was managing a mine. Tanya came to my father, honestly told him everything that had happened to her, and asked for a job with the mine. Papa brought her home. I didn't really understand what she was saying, and didn't try to pass the new words I was hearing. Kolkhoz, kulak, middle class, poor peasant, militia, exile, resettlement, and work norm. I was then only 8 years old.